For centuries, knowledge has been hidden in plain sight across the sands of time. Whispers of lost civilizations, cryptic symbols, and forbidden histories have been erased or concealed. What if the truth was never lost, but hidden? Welcome to Eye of Ancient Mysteries, where the past speaks and the future listens. Sit back, open your mind, and prepare to uncover the untold secrets of our world. Let the journey begin now. A talk with a mummy. The symposium the night before had done quite a number on my nerves. I was miserable, suffering from a terrible headache, and felt a desperate need for sleep. So instead of going out for a walk, as I had originally planned, a sudden idea struck me that the best solution would be to grab a quick bite and head straight to bed. Just a light supper, of course. By the way, I'm quite a fan of toast with cheese, but it's not recommended to eat more than a pound of it. I wouldn't mind 2. Actually, there's a difference between 2 and 3, though only by 1 unit. I'd risk 4. My wife would prefer 5, but to clarify, I should add that she mixes up 2 entirely different things. I suppose one is the abstract number 5, and the other refers to bottles of brown stout, without which that meal would feel bland, and one might as well abstain from the dish entirely. So, after finishing a hearty meal, I adjusted my nightcap with the heartfelt hope of enjoying it all the way until noon the next day, laid my head on the pillow, and with the help of a clear conscience, fell into a deep sleep immediately. But when have human hopes ever come true? I had barely snored 3 times when I heard a furious ringing of the doorbell, followed by impatient knocking that fully woke me. A minute later, still rubbing my eyes, my wife came and shoved a note into my face from my old friend, Dr. Poniner. It read as follows: My dear friend, come to me at once the moment you receive this note. Come to lighten the mood. At last, after long and persistent diplomatic efforts, I have secured permission from the City Museum's directors to conduct a full examination of the mummy. You know which one I mean. I'm allowed to remove the bandages and, if necessary, perform a dissection. Only a few friends will be present, yourself included, of course. The mummy is currently at my home, and we will begin unwrapping it at 11 o'clock tonight. Ever yours, Poniner. By the time I reached the word Poniner, I was wide awake. I jumped out of bed with enthusiasm and dressed in an astonishingly quick manner, tossing aside everything in my path, and rushed off to the doctor's as fast as I could. A group of eager individuals had already gathered there, waiting for me. The mummy was stretched out on the dining table, and the examination began as soon as I entered the room. It was one of a pair of mummies brought several years ago from a tomb near Elatheus in the Libyan mountains, far above Thebes on the Nile, by Captain Arthur Sabratash, a cousin of Poniner. The caves carved in that region lacked the grandeur of the Theban tombs, but were more interesting due to the numerous wall paintings that offered glimpses into everyday Egyptian life. It was said that the tomb from which this specimen came was rich in such imagery. The walls were fully adorned with frescoes and bas reliefs, and the presence of statues, vases, and lavish mosaics spoke of the wealth of the deceased. The treasure had been entrusted to the museum in exactly the condition Captain Sabratash had found it. That is, the coffin had never been opened. It remained untouched behind glass for 8 years, and so we now had the mummy entirely at our disposal. And those who understand how rare it is for an ancient artifact to reach our shores untouched will immediately grasp how lucky we were. As I approached the table, I saw a large box or chest, nearly 7 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2.5 feet deep. It was elongated but didn't resemble a traditional coffin. At first, we thought it was made of sycamore wood, but on closer inspection, we realized it was made of cardboard, or more precisely papier-mâché, formed from papyrus. It was richly decorated with paintings of burial scenes and ritual objects, interspersed with hieroglyphs that most likely identified the deceased. Luckily, Mr. Glidden was among us, and he had no trouble translating the phonetic signs, which spelled out the name Alamastakio. We had some difficulty opening the box without damaging it, but eventually managed it perfectly and discovered a second coffin-shaped box inside, smaller than the first, but otherwise identical in design. The space between the two was filled with plant resin, which had somewhat faded the colors on the inner coffin. Opening it, which was easier, we found a third coffin, also similar in shape, but made of cedar wood, still giving off its distinctive strong scent. This third coffin fit snugly inside the second, with no space in between. Inside the third box was the mummy itself. Contrary to expectations, it wasn't wrapped in linen strips, but in papyrus covered with plaster, gilded, and elaborately painted. The artwork depicted various imagined duties of the soul and its judgment before different deities, along with numerous identical human figures, likely portraits of the embalmed person. A column of hieroglyphs ran the length of the body, naming the deceased and his relatives. Around the neck was a collar sewn with glass beads in different colors, forming the shapes of deities, scarabs, and the celestial sphere. A belt was wrapped around the waist. Removing the papyrus, we revealed the flesh, remarkably preserved, odorless, and reddish in color. The skin was taut, smooth, and shiny. Teeth and hair were in good condition. The eyes, or so we thought, had been removed and replaced with beautifully made glass ones that looked surprisingly lifelike, save for an intense stare. Fingernails and toenails were finely gilded. Due to the skin's reddish hue, Mr. Glidden believed the embalming had been done with asphalt resin. But after scraping off a bit of the surface and tossing the powder into the fire, we detected the strong aroma of camphor and other sweet-smelling resins. We examined the body carefully, searching for the usual incisions made to extract the internal organs, but to our surprise found none. We all knew that fully intact mummies were extremely rare. Typically, the brain would be removed through the nostrils and the internal organs through a side cut. The body would then be shaved, washed, salted, and left for several weeks before embalming. Not finding any such incision, Dr. Ponnonner prepared his dissection tools, but seeing it was already past 2 in the morning, we decided to postpone the internal examination until the next night. We were just about to leave when someone suggested testing the mummy with a voltaic battery. Running an electric current through a 3 or 4,000-year-old mummy was, if not wise, at least a unique idea, and we all eagerly agreed. Half serious, half laughing, we set up the battery in the doctor's office and brought the Egyptian there. After much effort, we exposed some of the temple muscles, which were less hardened than the rest of the body. As expected, there was no galvanic reaction. This final test confirmed our assumptions, and we were all laughing at our foolishness and getting ready to say good night when my gaze accidentally fell on the mummy's eyes. To my astonishment, I noticed that the previously wide, glassy stare was now covered by the eyelids. Just a tiny sliver of the tunica albuginea was still visible. My shout drew everyone's attention. I wouldn't say I was scared. Scared isn't quite the word. Perhaps I was a little jittery from the strong beer. As for the others, they tried to hide their terror. Poor Dr. Ponnonner looked devastated. Mr. Glidden had somehow disappeared entirely, and as for Mr. Silk Buckingham, I doubt he would deny that he crawled under the table on all fours. In any case, once the initial shock wore off, we proceeded with further experiments. We targeted the big toe on the right foot, made an incision to reach the abductor muscle, and connected the wires. As soon as we activated the battery, the mummy bent its right knee with startling vitality and kicked Dr. Ponnonner with such force that the poor man was launched straight through the window and down to the street like a catapulted stone. We rushed out en masse to collect his remains, but to our surprise, we met him already racing back up the stairs, full of fiery enthusiasm and eager to continue the experiment. Following his advice, we made a deep incision on the mummy's nose, and the doctor pulled it upward for better contact with the wire. The result, both physically and metaphorically, was explosive. First, the mummy opened its eyes and blinked rapidly like a pantomime performer. Then it sneezed. Then it sat up. Fourth, it shook its fist at Dr. Ponnonner. And fifth, turning to Messrs. Glidden and Buckingham, it greeted them in flawless Egyptian, saying, "Gentlemen, I must say, I am just as surprised as I am offended by your behavior. From Dr. Ponnonner, I expected no better. He is a pitiful, bloated fool who has never been anything else. I pity him. But you, Mr. Glidden, and you, Silk, you who have lived in Egypt long enough to pass for natives, who speak Egyptian as well as your mother tongue, you whom I always regarded as a friend of the mummies, from you I expected better manners. What am I to think as I watch you allow your companions to treat me so indecently? What am I to conclude, seeing you stand by while Tom, Dick, and Harry strip me naked in this horribly cold climate? And to the point, what am I to make of you, helping and encouraging that miserable villain, Dr. Ponnonner, to tug on my nose? It's not hard to understand that Mr. Glidden steered the conversation toward the immense benefits science has received from the unwrapping and disemboweling of mummies, apologizing in particular for the fact that the unique, original mummy named Alamistachio had been disturbed. He concluded with a light hint, hardly surprising that now that such minor issues were clarified, it would be a good idea to continue the examination. At this point, Dr. Ponnonner prepared his instruments. It became clear that Alamistachio had certain hesitations regarding the speaker's last proposals, although I couldn't quite grasp their exact nature. However, he expressed satisfaction with the offered apology and, stepping down from the table, shook hands with everyone in the group. Once this ceremony ended, we immediately got to work repairing the damage our patient had suffered at the hands of the scalpel. We stitched the wound on his temple, bandaged his leg, and placed a piece of adhesive plaster on the tip of his nose. Soon, we noticed that the Count, as it seemed Alamistachio bore a title, was shivering slightly, undoubtedly from the cold. The doctor rushed off to his wardrobe and soon returned with a black evening coat of excellent Jennings tailoring, a pair of sky blue plaid trousers with stirrups, a pink Oxford shirt, a rustling brocade vest, a wide white overcoat, a cane with a curved handle, a brimless hat, patent leather boots, straw, yellow kidskin gloves, a monocle, a pair of fake sideburns, and a richly folded silk neckerchief. Due to the discrepancy in size between the Count and the doctors, the ratio being 2-to-1, it took some effort to dress the Egyptian, but once it was done, one could say he was clothed. Mr. Glidden then took him by the hand and led him to a comfortable chair by the fireplace, while the doctor rang the bell and ordered wine and cigars. Soon, the conversation grew lively. Naturally, everyone was intensely curious about the remarkable fact that Alamistachio was still alive. "I think," remarked Mr. Buckingham, "that you ought to have been dead long ago, very long ago." "And why is that?" asked the Count in surprise. "I'm just over 700 years old." "My father lived to be 1,000, and he wasn't senile when he died." This prompted a flurry of questions and calculations, which revealed that there had been a significant miscalculation in the mummy's age. It had been 5,050 years and some months since the Count had been buried in the catacombs of Eleithias. "But my remark," resumed Mr. Buckingham, "does not concern your age at the time of burial. I'm willing to accept that you were still young. My point refers to the incredibly long period during which, by your own account, you must have lain wrapped in bituminous resin." "In what?" asked the Count. "In bituminous resin," Mr. B. insisted. "Ah, yes. I have a vague idea of what you mean. I might cobble together some sort of answer, but in my time, nothing other than mercuric chloride was usually employed." "What we cannot understand," said Dr. Ponnonner, "is how, after being dead and buried in Egypt for 5,000 years, you are now here, very much alive and looking quite well." "If I had been dead, as you say," replied the Count, "then clearly I would still be dead. I now understand that you're just beginning to discover galvanism and cannot yet do with it what we used to consider a common practice. In fact, I had fallen into a state of catalepsy, and my well-meaning friends assumed I was dead, or thought I should be, and embalmed me immediately. I suppose you know the basic principle of embalming? No, not entirely. I see. Your ignorance is quite regrettable. Since I cannot go into detail now, I must explain that embalming in the Egyptian sense meant the immediate and indefinite suspension of all vital functions. I use vital in the broadest sense, encompassing both physical and moral activities, everything in a living organism. Again, the main principle of our embalming was to halt and arrest all vital functions. And to be brief, the individual remained in whatever state they were in at the moment of embalming. I was fortunate, being of the bloodline of the Scarabaeus, and was embalmed alive, just as you see me now. "Off the blood of the Scarabaeus!" exclaimed Dr. Panunner. Yes, the Scarabaeus was the symbol or heraldic device of a very refined and distinguished aristocratic family. To have Scarabaean blood in your veins meant that you were a member of this family, whose emblem was the sacred beetle. And what does that have to do with your being alive? What? Everything. The common practice in Egypt was to remove the internal organs and brain during embalming. Only the Scarabaean family did not follow this practice. If I were not of that lineage, I'd have been left without guts or brain, and it's rather inconvenient to live without either. "I see," said Mr. Buckingham. "Then all the perfectly preserved and intact mummies we've found must be from the Scarabaeus lineage. There's no doubt about it. I had thought," Mr. Glidden said humbly, "that the Scarabaeus was one of the Egyptian gods." "One of what?" the mummy exclaimed, leaping from his seat. "One of the gods," repeated the traveler. "Mr. Glidden, I am truly shocked to hear such a statement from you," said the Count, sitting again. "No nation on earth has ever acknowledged more than one god, the Scarabaeus ibis, and so onwards, as with other nations, merely symbols or intermediaries through which we offered our reverence to the Creator. Far too majestic to be approached directly." There was a pause. After a while, the conversation was resumed by Dr. Panunner. "From your explanation, it seems highly probable that other mummies from the Scarabaeus lineage are still alive in the catacombs along the Nile." "No doubt," replied the Count. "All Scarabaei embalmed by chance while still alive are still alive. Even some deliberately embalmed might have been overlooked by their executors and remain in tombs." "Would you be so kind," I interjected, "as to explain what you mean by deliberately embalmed?" "With great pleasure," the mummy answered after peering at me leisurely through his monocle, since this was the first question I had dared address him directly. The usual human lifespan in my time was about 800 years. Few died before 600 unless due to extraordinary circumstances. Some lived more than 1,000, but 800 was the norm. Once the principle of embalming, as I described it, was discovered, it occurred to our learned men that, apart from satisfying intellectual curiosity, science would benefit if that normal lifespan could be lived in parts. And indeed, Experience showed that this was essential for the accuracy of history. A historian, for example, reaching the age of 500, might write a book and have himself carefully embalmed, instructing his executors to revive him in 500 or 600 years. Upon revival, he would no doubt find his great work turned into a haphazard notebook or a battleground for fierce commentaries and wild theories. These annotations would have so obscured and twisted the original text that the author would need a lantern to find his own book. And once found, he'd have to rewrite it, and then, based on his own experiences, correct all the errors concerning his era. So, this process of rewriting and correction by the original author, practiced from time to time by individual sages, prevented our history from degenerating into complete fiction. "I beg your pardon," said Dr. Ponnonner at this point, lightly placing a hand on the Egyptian's arm. "Excuse me, sir, but may I interrupt for a moment?" "Certainly, sir," replied the Count, standing. "I merely want to ask one question," said the doctor. "You mentioned corrections made by the historian to the traditions of his own era. For heaven's sake, sir, could you tell us what percentage of that Kabbalah usually turned out to be correct?" "The Kabbalah, as you call it, sir, was invented to match the facts in histories that were not revised. That means that in every case, not a single word of it was accurate. But since it's clear," the doctor resumed, "that at least 5,000 years have passed since you were sealed in the tomb, I suppose that, if not the traditions, then at least your historical books of that period must have been quite specific on the universally important matter of creation, which, as you know, occurred only 10 centuries ago." "Excuse me," said Count Alamistachio. The doctor repeated his remark, but only after many clarifications did the foreigner understand. Finally, he said hesitantly, "I must admit, the ideas you express are completely unfamiliar to me. In my time, I never heard of anyone who imagined that the universe, or the world, as you say, had a beginning. I recall only once hearing the vaguest mention of the origin of mankind, and that from a philosopher who used the same term you now do, Adam or red-earthed. In fact, he used it in the broadest sense, referring to the spontaneous sprouting of 5 great human races simultaneously in 5 separate but nearly identical regions of the globe. At these words, the company began nudging each other, and 1 or 2 tapped their foreheads meaningfully. Mr. Silk Buckingham, after inspecting both the back and top of Alamistachio's head, declared, "The extraordinary longevity of life in your time, combined with the habit of living it in segments, must have greatly influenced the accumulation of knowledge. Therefore, I suggest that the obvious backwardness of ancient Egyptians in all fields of science, especially compared to modern achievements, particularly those of the Yankees, is primarily due to the superior thickness of the Egyptian skull. I must admit once again," the Count replied politely, "that I struggle to understand you. Please tell me which branches of science you particularly mean." At that, the entire company launched into an excited explanation of the common theories on phrenology, and the marvel of animal magnetism. After listening patiently, the Count recounted anecdotes proving that the originals of gall and sperjame had risen and faded in Egypt so long ago they were nearly forgotten, and that the tricks of Mesmer were laughable compared to the real marvels of Theban scholars, who created lice and other wonders. I interrupted the Count to ask whether his contemporaries could predict eclipses. He laughed with mild contempt and said, "Of course they could." I was a little embarrassed, but kept questioning him about his astronomical knowledge until one of our group, who had been silent the whole time, whispered to me that I'd do better to ask Ptolemy instead, no matter who he was, as well as to a certain Plutarch regarding de facie in orbe luni apparet. Then I asked the mummy about burning lenses and magnifying glasses, and in general about the art of glass-making, but I hadn't yet finished with my questions when the silent member of our group gently took me by the elbow, imploring me, for God's sake, to have mercy and consult Diodorus Siculus. The Count, instead of answering, simply asked whether we moderns possessed such microscopes as could engrave a cameo the way the Egyptians used to. While I was still considering how to respond to this question, little Dr. Ponener managed to embarrass himself in a remarkable fashion. "Look at our architecture," he exclaimed, to the great distress of the two travelers, who pinched him black and blue, but to no avail. "Behold," he shouted with enthusiasm, "the Bowling Green Fountain in New York, and if that's too massive for your contemplation, then just take a glance at the Capitol in Washington." The good little doctor proceeded to describe the dimensions of the object in question in the most minute detail. He explained that the portico alone was adorned with no fewer than 24 columns, each 5 feet in diameter, spaced 10 feet apart. The Count expressed regret that he couldn't recall the exact measurements of any of the more renowned buildings in the city of Aznak, whose foundations were laid at an unknown time and whose ruins still stood in a vast sandy desert west of Thebes at the time of his burial. In fact, speaking of porticos, he remembered a similar one in a certain forgotten palace on the outskirts of Karnak. This portico had 144 columns, each with a circumference of 37 feet, spaced 25 feet apart. To reach it from the Nile, one had to walk a 2-mile avenue lined with sphinxes, statues, and obelisks some 20, 60, and even 100 feet tall. The palace itself, as far as he remembered, stretched 2 miles on one side. Its circumference was likely about 7 miles. The walls were richly decorated with hieroglyphs, inside and out. He was willing to state without hesitation that 50 or 60 of the doctor's capitals could easily fit within those walls, though he wasn't entirely sure that 200 or 300 such buildings couldn't be crammed in without trouble. And the palace at Karnak, he added, was just a small, insignificant structure. Still, he couldn't deny the originality, magnificence, and perfection of the Bowling Green Fountain as described by the doctor. After all, he was forced to admit he had seen nothing like it either in Egypt or elsewhere. I then asked the Count what he thought of our railroads. "Not much," he replied. "They are weak, poorly built, and clumsily laid. They are nothing compared to the enormous level and straight roads with metal grooves the Egyptians used to transport entire temples and colossal obelisks, each 150 feet tall. I brought up our tremendous technological powers. He admitted that we had some notion of these things, but asked how I would lift the columns supporting the arches atop the roof beams of even the small palace at Karnak. I decided to pretend I hadn't heard the question and asked if he had any idea about artesian wells. In response, the Count merely raised his eyebrows, while Mr. Glidden winked at me and whispered that engineers recently hired to search for water had discovered such a well in the Great Oasis. Then I mentioned steel, but the foreigner wrinkled his nose and asked whether that same steel could produce engravings as fine as those seen on the obelisks, though they had been carved using copper tools. This discouraged us so much that we decided to change tack and turn toward metaphysics. We requested a copy of a book called The Dial and read a few chapters that spoke, somewhat opaquely, about something the inhabitants of Boston refer to as the Great Movement toward Progress. The Count merely noted that great movements were quite common in his time as well, and as for progress, it was a very tedious thing that never really managed to gain any traction. Then we spoke of the beauty and great importance of democracy, but we were hard pressed to convey to the Count the proper sense of the advantages we enjoyed living in a country with voting rights ad libitum and no kings. He listened with apparent interest, though also with a look of considerable amusement. When we were done, he stated that long ago something very similar had happened. 13 Egyptian provinces had suddenly decided to be free and to offer a splendid example to the rest of humanity. They gathered their wise men and drafted the most original constitution imaginable. For a while, everything went extremely well, if only they hadn't had that peculiar habit of bragging. Eventually, it all ended with the union of the 13 states with another 15 or 20, but it was done in the most disgraceful manner and led to the most intolerable despotism the world had ever seen. I asked for the name of the tyrant, usurper. As far as the Count could remember, it was the mob. Not knowing how to continue the conversation, I raised my voice and expressed my regret that the Egyptians had never discovered steam power. The Count looked at me in great surprise, but said nothing. Meanwhile, the silent gentleman jabbed me sharply in the ribs with his elbow, and after telling me I'd made a fool of myself enough already, demanded to know whether I was really so ignorant as not to know that the modern locomotive derived from Hero's invention through Solomon de Cos. At this point, we were in grave danger of losing all credibility, but fortunately Dr. Ponener, having regained his composure, turned to the revived one and asked whether Egyptians had ever laid claim to rival modern man in the most vital points of dress. At this, the Count looked down at the straps of his trousers, then lifted one of the long tails of his coat near his eyes and examined it closely. When he finally let it drop, his mouth spread into a smile that reached from ear to ear. I don't recall him saying anything in reply. We had finally recovered some confidence, and the doctor, turning to the mummy with great dignity, requested that he answer honestly and frankly, as befits a true nobleman, whether at any point in their history the Egyptians had ever understood the manufacture of sugar, coated pills like those of Panonner, or Brendreth's pills. We waited for a response with infinite impatience, but in vain. There was no reply. The Egyptian blushed and lowered his head. Never had victory been so complete. Never had defeat been accepted with such evident reluctance. I truly could no longer bear the sight of the poor, humiliated mummy. I picked up my hat, bowed coldly, and left. When I got home, it was past 4 o'clock, and I went to bed immediately. It is now 10 in the morning. I woke at 7 to write these notes for the benefit of my family and of mankind at large. As for the family, I won't see them again. My wife is mean and quarrelsome. The truth is, I'm sick of this life. I'm disgusted with both it and the 19th century in general. I'm convinced that everything is going downhill. Moreover, I burn with curiosity to know who will be president in the year 2045. That is why, as soon as I've shaved and had a cup of coffee, I'll drop by Panonner's and ask him to embalm me for a few hundred years.